Streamen är uppe, allting är uppe. Hur vad som helst. Bra? Det är bra tror jag. Kan du gå in på sidan och lägga upp streamen där? Att väl? Tycker jag. Ja, det går. Jo då, det är bra. Jag har fått igång här på en. Nej, ja precis. Precis. Vi håller Sverige där. Ja, det är det. Ja, ja. Förlåt? Ja. Kärnämnesvärldsspåret. Det var den nya. Tankesmedjafrågor. Tankesmedjafrågor. Direkt. Ja, säkert. Ja. Du vet det.
Okay, welcome everyone. Nice to see so many here. My name is Andreas Bergström, and I am Deputy Director of the think tank FORES, Forum for Reforms and Entrepreneurship. And I welcome you all to this conference on Europe's crisis, or as we call it, Europe out of the ashes or into the fire. And I thank very much the Commission's representation and the Information Office of the European Parliament for letting us use this nice facilities, nice and central and bigger than our own, so we couldn't fit this many into our own facilities. And I also thank Ungdomsstyrelsen for the funding of this project. If you use your mobile phones, it won't disturb me at all because I expect you to tweet and you use the hashtag #4S simply. So go ahead. This is the summing up of a one-year project on Europe's economic crisis. We've had several seminars. We published a book in November. I hope most of you, at least the ones who read Swedish, have the book now. It was handed out when you came. The seminars can be seen on our YouTube channel or our webpage. And I can't think of anyone better to start this conference than Sweden's EU Minister, Birgitta Ohlsson, who very kindly has come here to start this all with a short speech. Welcome up, Birgitta.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Andreas. And I really listened to your will that we were going to start a tweet. So I already tweeted and trying to promote this conference. And first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me here to this seminar, along with so many distinguished guests and speakers, because we have a very impressive list of the speakers today. And I'm also very thankful for you at FORES for all the work that you have done in this project about the economic crisis in Europe. And I would like to describe this full-day seminar as kind of the crescendo of this project. And it's extremely important to stimulate right now a debate on the future of the European Union, because we do need to deepen the cooperation in the EU of today. But before to take the steps, we have to discuss where to go, and I think that's the key thing the debate of Europe today. Support comes with obligations. Solidarity requires taking responsibility. These are the words of Angela Merkel from an election debate in Germany last year. And I think that in one way Angela Merkel has taken a great responsibility in resolving the economic crisis. But the solution in the long run cannot be that German taxpayers take over other countries' national debts or pay other countries' unemployment costs. I do not think there is a popular support for moving money between countries year in and year out. That has been the case for several years right now. Countries cannot support each other in the long run in this way, because this will jeopardize the legitimacy of the European Union. The solution is rather that all member states must continue the grueling task of making EU countries more competitive through structural reforms, for developing the single market, and of course promoting free trade more with other parts of the world. Right now we have our very strong initiative in the European Union. We call it EU 2020. The goal is to make the Union more competitive by the year of 2020. And these cold facts should be taken. Europe cannot afford to retire at the age of 55 or 60 or even 65 in the future. Europe cannot afford to have the best educated housewives in the world. That is actually the case today. And Europe cannot afford to throw money at land-owning lords. However, member states, with room for maneuvering to stimulate their own economies to get the wheel spinning, need to do that again. But getting Europe's economy well again is crucial also to this country, Sweden, of course. Because if one member state's economy collapses, it affects us all. We cannot export our products and services. No member state is an isolated island. And economic decisions in one member state are not only of national concern today. We all want our common currency to work. We want our economies in the EU countries to work together, and we want Europe's bank to be able to work good, because it's important with financial stability, also here from our perspective. After 5 years of economic crisis, we are now also suffering from a political crisis in many parts of the Union. It has to do with xenophobia, of course. It has to do with Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Ziganism. They're gaining ground in far too many countries, also in this country. And it's actually true that not since Second World War II there have been so many racist parties in the EU countries' national parliaments as we have speaking here today. We often discuss the economic crisis in Europe, but it's also time to speak of the values crisis looming in many European Union crises, because Europe right now is at a crossroads. 85% of the Swedes voted in the parliamentary elections in 2010. And this is a high number compared to many other European countries. But only 45% of the Swedes voted in the elections to the European Parliament in 2009. That's more than every other Swede that did not take the opportunity to cast a vote in the elections to the European Parliament. On May 25th this year, it's time again. And my goal also as the Minister responsible for democracy affairs, I hope that at least half of the Swedish population will go to the cast and will cast their ballots. This might seem as a modest goal, but I think it would be very good to energize our debate. To succeed, we need to work hard and be creative. And I think this project here by Forest is one initiative that the government actually supported to stimulate the debate in a successful way. And we will also, for the first time in Sweden, arrange mock elections in our schools to raise the awareness among young people. Because we see that especially young people are not that active in the European Union affairs issues and do not vote as much as we want them to do. I had a great conversation yesterday with the new Ministry for European Union Affairs from Germany, Michel Roth, about this issue, and we will try to work together with like-minded countries in this area. And also the political parties need to be more active. I think actually the debate in Sweden today about the European Union affairs issues is kind of sad. We need to have more people being active on both sides. And we need to show the electorate there are clear alternatives for the voters here. That liberals, social democrats, greens and conservatives actually do have completely different visions for European cooperation in many ways. It is also a litmus test for democracy when the right-wing extremist forces and the populist forces and the xenophobic forces are gaining power. Right now, 29% of the Europeans feel negatively about the European Union. 15% was the corresponding number only 5 years ago, and this is a frank result of the economic crisis. Faith in political systems in far too many countries is very low right now, and we must take this very seriously because there is no quick fix on this issue. If we want to strengthen democracy, if we want to make the EU more legitimate in the eyes of the citizens, we need to work hard with reforms. But there are some glimpses of hope. The Swedish Statistical Bureau presented a few new figures for the Swedish population in December on the review of the European Union. They show that the trend of negative feelings about the EU among the Swedish populations has actually been broken right now. Today, only 1/4 of the population is skeptical, and we're back actually to the figures we had before the crisis started in 2008, and I think that's a success. But first of all, we need to make the EU more open and comprehensible, and my government is trying to work hard to implement a transparency principle in the whole European Union, because the rules are in place, but the work for openness must be improved, even if this is an uphill task, I have to admit, right now. The ability to request documents from Brussels should be taken for granted, as it is here in Sweden. Second of all, we need to strengthen democracy and the opportunities for influence. One example could be, what I say in the Council, the General Affairs Council, must have support in the Parliament's Committee on European Union Affairs before I go to the meetings in Brussels. And this is not the case in all member states today. And I would like to urge all governments in all member states to commit to consult their national parliaments before they go to Brussels and take the decisions. Third of all, we need to safeguard the EU institutions. A strong European Commission, a strong European Parliament, a strong Council, in which politicians and decision makers can be held accountable. And these are the three institutions we all need to work for the best of Europe. If you don't like Europe the way it is, make it better. So said José Manuel Barroso in his State of the Union speech. And that was kind of a good point, I think, because the EU needs to focus more on the right things. We must not, need not, and should not make common decisions on everything. Or once to quote Barroso, the EU needs to be big on the big things and smaller on the small things. I self want an optional, not a minimal EU. We need to be more optimal EU, but we should not reduce EU to be a minimum. Many have compared EU by going with a bicycle. If you don't pedal, you fall, and if your load is too heavy, you keel over. And we must adjust the speed so we don't bike away from the citizens. That is sometimes the case, actually, today. And we must know where we want to end up. And here, the responsibility is very important from all political leaders in Europe. I look forward to the discussions today during the day, and I think that this is one good initiative to start the debate actually in Sweden. Thank you so much for arranging this day.
Thank you, Birgitta. So, we are now moving on to our keynote speaker. Do you know what actually a keynote is? I'm not sure if everyone who's a Swedish speaker knows what it actually is. It's a word you hear at conferences. Keynote is when if you sing in a choir, for example, and you sing a cappella, you sing without any instruments. You need to know where to start to sing. Everyone to sing in tune. So you often use a pitchfork. You get the tone, and you know where to start, and that makes everyone sing in harmony, hopefully. So, we have a keynote speaker today, who I hope will set the tone for this conference. And it's Philippe Legrain. Philippe is, at the moment, independent economic advisor to the President of the European Commission, that is Barroso. You've been a journalist at The Economist, author of several books, one of which we have translated and are selling today. So you can buy his book in Swedish at the entrance. Please do. Philippe, I think you're really formidable at combining a human perspective with a deep knowledge of economy. I think that's quite unique. You'll soon be leaving the Commission to be working on your own. You have a new book on the way, I know. It's about the crisis, isn't it? So it will be, I know that you really are up to date about everything we'll talk about today. So I'm looking forward to hear you give us an introduction to the crisis, or the crises, that we will be talking about today. Please, Philippe.
Good morning. Thank you, Andreas, for that kind introduction. It's great to be here. I actually have links with both the organisers. Forrest obviously published recently one of my books called Immigrants to a Country Needs Them. And as Andreas said, for the past 3 years I've been working for President Barroso. I recently, just before Christmas, resigned, so I'm speaking today in a personal capacity. Now, I've been asked to provide you with a big picture and a human dimension of the crisis in Europe. And the subsequent questions today will fill in the specifics about the 3 overlapping crises that Europe is facing. An unresolved banking crisis with associated high debt levels, the particular complexities of the crisis in the Eurozone, and last but not least, a long-standing productivity crisis that affects not just Southern Europe, but the whole continent. Now, in the boom years, banks lent too much, badly. House prices soared. Then the bubble burst, banks went bust, the economy tanked, and the government stepped in to support the economy and to bail out the banks. That's what happened in Sweden, Norway, and Finland in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. And it's basically what has happened in the rest of Europe over the past decade. Now, I didn't feel like it at the time, but Sweden and its Nordic neighbours were lucky to have their banking crises before everyone else. Because back then, the financial system was smaller, simpler, less internationally interconnected. So the crisis was more easily contained and resolved than now. Because at the moment, the creditors, not least the French and German banks that did much of the bad lending, are often in different countries to the debtors, notably in Southern Europe. And because conditions in other Western economies were much more favourable in the early 90s, it was much easier for the relatively small Nordic economies to bounce back. And last but not least, because memories of the banking crisis in Sweden were still fresh, the Nordics avoided most of the excesses of the Western financial system in the years up to 2007. Now, it's true that some Swedish banks made lots of bad loans in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, but in the end, they pulled through without government support. So while Sweden suffered a short, sharp recession when the collapse of Lehman Brothers pushed the global economy into a tailspin in late 2008, since then, Sweden has grown faster, more than any other advanced EU economy. Despite the triumphalism in Berlin, Germany's economy has only grown by 2.5% since 2008. Sweden's has grown by 5%. Public debt in Germany is 80% of GDP. Here, it's 40% of GDP. And while most of Europe is going through austerity, last year, the Swedish government provided a fiscal stimulus when the economy started to slow. So talking about the crisis here in prosperous and stable Stockholm, seems a bit like otherworldly. The rest of Europe is in crisis. Here in Sweden, it doesn't feel at all like you are. Look south, though. In Greece, where the economy has shrunk by 1/4, children scavenge through rubbish bins for scraps of food, while hospitals run short of medicine. In Spain, where more than 1 in 4 people are unemployed, so many people kill themselves that suicide is now the top cause of death after natural causes. In Ireland, where house prices have more than halved, 1 in 4 homeowners are in arrears on their mortgages, which are often greater than the value of their deflated homes. And where the cost to taxpayers of bailing out the banks that provided these bad mortgage loans is equivalent to half of national income. Or in Italy, 2 in 5 young people are out of work. In Greece and Spain, it's nearly 3 in 5 young people. A lost generation is in the making. So is it any surprise that young Europeans are having even fewer babies since the crisis? And that every 6 minutes someone emigrates from Ireland? Now, the situation in Southern Europe is particularly severe, but actually most of Europe is suffering. Across the European Union, 1 in 8 people is unemployed. 27 million people, many of them for a long time. 15 million young Europeans are neither in employment nor education, including, incidentally, far too many young Swedes. Living standards are being squeezed. In my own country, Britain, real wages have fallen by 8%. And even in Germany, which is supposedly successful, wages are lower than they were 15 years ago. So yes, there's good news. Finally, most European economies are starting to grow again, albeit very slowly. But they're still much smaller than they were 6 years ago. In fact, if you make a comparison, the Eurozone overall is faring worse than it did during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now, of course, it often takes time for economies to recover from a financial crisis, and they don't come much bigger than the recent one, because household spending remains depressed while people are trying to repay their debts. Banks stop lending while they repair their balance sheets. Companies are reluctant to invest while demand for their products is so uncertain. Capital and labour are not instantly redeployed to new businesses and sectors with potential future growth. Even so, Europe ought to have done more than it has done so far, because if you look across the Atlantic at the United States, even though the United States is struggling, it is doing much better than Europe is. Remember, the financial crisis originated in America. That's where the subprime crisis started. Even so, the US economy has grown faster than any other European economy since then, remarkably. Unemployment's much lower than most in Europe. Household debt has fallen significantly. House prices are rising again. Banks are lending again. Companies are starting to invest, and new areas of growth are emerging. The next wave of the digital revolution, a manufacturing renaissance fueled by new sources of energy, and booming exports to fast-growing economies like China and Mexico. Now, if you look back, in the first stage of the crisis, Europe, Britain and the Eurozone, tracked the progression of the US economy. They collapsed in late 2008. They bounced back in mid-2009 and rebounded in 2010. But after that, their paths diverged. While investment in growth in the United States continued to recover, they flatlined in Britain and they collapsed in parts of the Eurozone. And this divergence is in part due to policy mistakes by European policymakers who killed off the recovery while failing to deal with the real economic problems. And in particular in the Eurozone, these policy mistakes interacted with the Euro's design flaws to create an existential financial panic, which only abated in the summer of 2008 when the president of the European Central Bank declared that he would do whatever it takes to keep the euro together. So now we've had 5 to 6 years of crisis, and if you look at the statistics, European households are still as indebted as they were 6 years ago. Many banks are zombies. They're neither infused with enough fresh capital to lend, nor killed off. Banks, businesses either can't or won't invest, and promising sectors of the economy are often starved of the resources they need to grow, or stunted by regulation, by risk aversion, and by barriers to competition. So often it feels as if Europe is not just taking ages to get back on its feet, it's actually digging a bigger hole for itself. It looks like Southern Europe is sinking into a debt trap, while in my own country, Britain, we are trying to rekindle yet another housing bubble to get the economy going again. I think there's no denying that things are bad now, but some people, many prominent people, think that things are going to be worse in future. So you see economists talking about a new normal of permanently lower growth, a great stagnation of innovation, and even some people say the end of growth in the West altogether. Now certainly there are many worrying signs. You see the twin engines of higher living standards, which are productive investment and productivity growth. Europe is no longer catching up with America. In fact, since the mid-1990s, it's falling further behind. If you look at the figures from the OECD, in the past decade, labour productivity growth rose by 1.8% in the US. Sweden did very well, it was just behind, 1.7%. The Eurozone at 1%, Greece, incidentally, slightly ahead of Germany. Italy, 0 productivity growth. Now, why is this? Well, if you look again at the figures, you see not enough new businesses are launched in Europe. These startups have trouble lifting off. The growth in promising small companies often stalls. And established businesses that are protected from competition don't invest enough and don't innovate enough. Look at the internet revolution. With a few exceptions, both of them actually Swedish, Skype and Spotify, the internet revolution has happened elsewhere. The new giants of our digital world, Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, eBay, PayPal, all of them American. There is no European equivalent to Silicon Valley. And Europe isn't just falling further behind the United States. It faces ever greater competition from China, India, Brazil, Mexico, Turkey, and other emerging economies. Not just like before in lower-end manufacturing, but increasingly in higher tech sectors too. So look, who is Apple's biggest rival in smartphones? It's not Nokia, it's Samsung. The world's leader in solar panel production is no longer Germany, it's China. And the biggest manufacturer in Britain is an Indian company, Tata, which owns Jaguar Land Rover. Or you look at Europe's population trends. As the post-war baby boomers retire over the next 15 years or so, the burden on smaller, younger generations is going to be huge. In 2010, there were nearly 4 people of working age for every person aged 65 or over. By 2030, without migration, there will be fewer than 2.5. 2030 is around the corner. And the challenge isn't just financial, it's practical. Who is going to care for all these old people? And as the labour force shrinks, and even more so as the population declines, which it has been doing in Germany since 2004, economies will need to notch up faster productivity growth and more investment just to stand still. But if economies are likely to stand still, why invest? Now, to make matters worse, Europeans are much more risk-averse than Americans. They're less likely to start a business. They're less likely to embrace new innovations like genetically modified foods, like nanotechnology, or like shale gas. In fact, they're less willing to accept any risk at all in their lives. And is that going to change anymore as our societies become older? Now, in my view, increased immigration could be a big part of the solution to all of these problems. But unfortunately, it remains incredibly controversial. Now, put all this together. The danger is that Europe could get stuck in a semi-permanent winter, a prolonged period of economic stagnation and global decline like Japan has experienced in its 2 lost decades. In fact, it could be worse than that, because the Japanese have displayed a remarkable stoicism, a remarkable political stability during their long economic winter, but Europeans are not likely to be that accepting, because the crisis has exacerbated existing political tensions and it's created new ones. In many countries, the social fabric is fraying. People are increasingly turning on each other and lashing out at foreigners too. Many people have lost faith in mainstream politicians, in technocratic policymakers, in EU officials, and elites in general. They seem captured by they seem captured by vested interests. They seem unable to solve the crisis. They seem unable to put forward a vision of a brighter future. And that leaves the door open to extremists and charlatans who scapegoat outsiders and peddle false solutions. So you see in many countries that the politics is turning nasty, inward-looking, and fractious with unpredictable consequences. So as the Minister pointed out, in the European elections, we're likely to see a big increase in support for anti-establishment parties, which are generally xenophobic and reactionary. And Sweden, unfortunately, is not immune to the far-right virus, because the Sweden Democrats are at 10% in the polls. And the big danger is that ultimately the big achievement of post-war Europe, our open societies, could be at risk. Even in some countries, democracy could. You look at the worrying turn that Greece is taking with the rise of neo-Nazi Golden Dawn, or the lurch towards authoritarianism in Hungary. And the crisis is not just tearing societies apart, it's pitting societies against each other. So when I go to Germany, I get told that Greeks are all lazy, even though in fact they work longer hours than Germans do. And when I go to Greece, people label Germans Nazis, which is disgusting and wrong. A crisis that could have brought Europe together to try and tackle our financial and other problems has instead torn us apart, pitting creditors against debtors. Before, the EU was associated with prosperity. Now it is associated with austerity and recession. It's astonishing, given all the achievements of the European Union, that most Europeans now think that economic integration in Europe has been bad for their economy. Support for the EU has collapsed. You see that the EU is actually even less popular in France than in my own country, which is traditionally Eurosceptic, Britain. And it's even conceivable, unfortunately, that Britain will vote to leave the EU in 2017. On the other hand, despite the crisis, most people want to hold on to the euro, even in Greece. So the big question is, how does Europe get out of this mess? Is ongoing stagnation inevitable? Is the task of politicians simply to muddle through, to massage down expectations, to manage decline? Do people have to turn to extremists for alternative solutions? Hopefully, today's conference can shed light on all these incredibly important questions. But while most Europeans are pessimistic about the future and are convinced that their children will lead a worse life than they will, my forthcoming book, which is called European Spring, Why Europe's Economies and Politics Are in a Mess and How to Put Them Right, takes a more positive view. Yes, the current situation is grim, but stagnation, decline and a lurch towards political extremism are not inevitable. A much brighter future is possible if we change course. We need to dispel bad ideas. We need to confront vested interests. And we need to improve our institutions. To escape from this long, dark winter, we need a European spring. Economic and political renewal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe. I think that's a very good start for our conference. And as Philippe said, it's split into 3 themes, and then we will wrap it up with a more political conclusion in the end. And the first theme we'll start with now is the crisis. Mixed with each other. So we published this book in November about the Euro crisis, and one of the chapters was written by Lars Calmfors, and I think most of you know who he is. Professor of International Economics at the Institute for International Economic Studies at Stockholm University, and you also have a regular column in Dagens Nyheter, the biggest morning paper in Sweden, which is always read and discussed in political and economic circles. And I'd say you are probably right now the most influential economist in the Swedish debate at the moment. So the chapter was very interesting, and I hope you will find it as interesting as we did. So welcome up, and please tell us about what you wrote in our book.
So, thank you for the kind introduction. Hope that I will be able to live up to it. I'm not as good a speaker as Philippe Legrain, so I will need some help from PowerPoint slides. Hope you can stand that. I will take another starting point, I will start with a little bit more of optimism, but you shouldn't be carried away by that, because it's partly to build a straw man that I can knock down later. But let me start with the observation that there are many fewer conferences on the Euro crisis today than, say, 2 years ago, which in a way is sad for those of us who have a great interest in the Euro. But of course the reason is that the crisis appears far less dramatic today. It's not the same sense of disaster as before. Why? Well, this is shown by this picture, that government bond yields in the crisis countries, they have come down. As we heard, this happened after the ECB in 2012 committed to buying unlimited amounts of short-term government bonds if that was required to hold down bond yields. In the last week, bond yields have even come down more than according to the diagram. Ireland and Portugal, they are now borrowing again in financial markets. There's even talk of Greece doing so later this year. And as we heard, growth seems to be picking up again. What I shall discuss is whether this current optimism, not here and not in the previous speech, but in markets, is that warranted? Well, we know that both markets and policymakers can be very wrong about future economic prospects. So I guess there are good reasons from the start to be skeptical. It does happen, of course, also that economists are wrong, but I'll take that risk and hope that if that is to be the case, then you have forgotten what I have said here when that day comes. Now, the Euro crisis is really 4 different crises. It's a sovereign debt crisis, it's a banking crisis, it's a growth crisis, it's a competitiveness crisis. These crises are highly interrelated. A banking crisis triggered the sovereign debt crisis in Ireland when the government absorbed bank losses. At the same time, losses on holdings of government bonds have exacerbated the banking crisis. Losses on Greek bonds contributed heavily to the bank failures in Cyprus. Reduced bank lending has exacerbated the recession that has in turn aggravated the banking crisis. Low growth has reduced tax revenues, aggravated the debt crisis, Spain being the best example. And at the same time, the attempts to fix the debt crisis through fiscal austerity has aggravated the downturn. We had higher inflation in the crisis countries than in the Eurozone core before 2007-2008. That implied real exchange rate appreciations that impacted negatively on net exports and on growth. So now the crisis countries must achieve real exchange rate depreciations. That is, they must reduce costs and prices relative to Germany and the other core countries, which requires wage cuts and larger productivity increases, or even positive ones, but we had negative ones before. And this in turn, of course, implies that employment must fall in the short run. Now, this is what I will take as the starting point for my discussion, this equation, which is very familiar to economists. It's the equation for how the government debt ratio, that is the ratio between government debt and GDP, changes from year to year. Now, I suspect that it may not be so popular with this type of mathematical formulas here, so I will not use the equation in this form. I just wanted to scare you a little bit before going on. So what I will do is to instead to resort to more verbal economics. So this is the same equation, but now in words. What does the formula say? It says that the change in percentage points in the government debt ratio from one year to another is approximately equal to the sum of two terms, what we economists call the primary fiscal deficit as a ratio to GDP. That is the difference between government expenditure and revenues when you exclude interest payments. And then the second term, that's the difference between the nominal interest rate the government has to pay and the nominal growth rate of GDP multiplied by the previous year's debt ratio. Before I use the formula, look at this. This shows how government debt has increased in the crisis countries. Well, you all know this, these huge increases. Why has the increase been so fast? Well, first it is because large primary deficits arose in the crisis countries. That's the first term in the equation. Second, when financial markets began to doubt the country's ability to service the debt, interest rates went up and GDP growth went down. So this meant that we had a large contribution to an increasing debt ratio also from the second term in the equation. Contribution was, of course, larger the larger the initial debt ratio, since this is what the difference between the interest rate and the growth rate is multiplied with. And this, of course, is the explanation why Greek debt increased so fast, because Greece started with such a high debt ratio. And you can see the jump there, of course, for Greece. It's a dent downwards, but that is, of course, just because of the debt write-downs for Greece. What has been the strategy to deal with the situation? Well, as we all know, to grant rescue loans to the crisis countries, combined with strict conditions on fiscal austerity. The aim is to turn the primary deficits into surpluses so that they contribute to a falling debt ratio. Now, the problem with this is that when fiscal policy is tightened, then aggregate demand falls. This reduces growth temporarily, possibly makes it negative, tends to reduce tax revenues. Theoretically, it's possible that the contractive effects of fiscal tightening are so large that the primary fiscal balance actually deteriorates in the short run. But this requires that the effects, the fiscal multipliers, are much larger than according to most estimates. Although there are arguments for why fiscal multipliers in a recession are likely to be larger than normally, so one can't completely rule out that the initial effect of fiscal tightening is a deterioration of the primary balance. But in fact, this has not happened. Fiscal tightening here, which is measured as the improvement of the cyclically adjusted primary fiscal balance, the balance that we would get under normal cyclical conditions, which is indicated here by the dots, has resulted, as you can see, in improvements of the actual fiscal balance in all the crisis countries except Cyprus. They are shown here in yellow. It's also important to realize that it is the strengthening of the fiscal balance, the change in it, that is contractive. But it's not contractive to remain in a stronger position once you are there. So gradually, the economies will return to higher capacity utilization as prices and wages adjust. What is required is real exchange rate depreciations, as I said initially, in the crisis countries vis-à-vis the euro countries, so that their relative costs fall. This will make the crisis countries more competitive again, will lead to higher net exports that will gradually restore growth. And such real depreciations are now occurring. Here you see Greece. The lower curves here show how relative wage costs per employee, that's the lowest curve, and relative unit labor costs have fallen vis-à-vis the other Eurozone countries, but only because of the extreme rises in unemployment, that's the upper curve, forcing labor to accept this. It is happening, though this gives an exaggerated picture because the wage cost numbers here are for the whole economy, so, which includes the public sector, where the wage cuts have been much larger than in the private sector. But it is the picture. Similar picture for Spain, qualitatively the same, but the real depreciation has been smaller. The conclusion from this is that in the long run, when the countries return to higher capacity utilization, which would give higher tax revenues again, one can be quite certain that the fiscal tightening will improve the fiscal balance. So it will eventually reduce the government debt ratio, provided that fiscal tightening is sustained and that it is pushed far enough so that primary deficits are indeed turned into surpluses. But unfortunately, most of the crisis countries are not yet there. In 2013, it was only Italy that had an actual primary surplus, denoted by black here. Portugal had it in cyclical terms. The Commission's forecast is that both Greece and Portugal will arrive there in actual terms this year, but of course such forecasts have many times before proved over-optimistic. There's also another problem. There is another problem. It's because the change in fiscal policy has a short-run contractive effect, which temporarily reduces the growth rate. This tends to make the government debt ratio actually grow faster in the short run via the second term that I had in my equation. That's because of the sort of effect of what is happening on nominal GDP growth, which is affected negatively for two reasons. One reason is the reduction in real growth. But it's also the problem that when this real depreciation is achieved through price falls, or at least lower price increases, that will compound the problem. And if we look at what has happened to nominal GDP growth, you can see it has been a problem that it has been negative in several of the crisis countries. And even this year, nominal GDP growth will be very, very low. So for all these reasons, it's not at all surprising that government debt ratios have continued to increase despite the fiscal tightening. But as I said, if the fiscal austerity is sustained in the crisis countries, if that were to be possible, it will eventually reverse debt developments, but it will take time before debt ratios can be substantially reduced. Because when debt developments are reversed, one will first have to work off the increase in the debt ratio that has occurred during this first period of fiscal adjustment. So where does this leave us? Well, it's not as simple as saying that just if we wait long enough, the euro crisis will subside. The problem is, as we heard, that since fiscal austerity, if this is the strategy that one follows, must be sustained for such a long time, it will impose unacceptable hardship on the citizens in the crisis countries, and it will carry huge political risks. Already now, this was also already said, but this is an illustration, there have been large falls in the trust of citizens in the EU, but not only in the EU, also in national governments. Although somewhat paradoxically, the support for the euro has fallen by less, and in Greece it has even increased, which is surprising, but it may be seen as a better alternative than not to have the euro. But anyway, the problem is that if we have a long period of high unemployment and fiscal austerity, this is likely to exacerbate these developments. And as we heard, prolonged austerity is likely to promote the rise of extremist parties. There's been research on election outcomes in the 1920s and 1930s that has shown a very clear link support for extremist parties and persistent economic contractions. It was not just Germany. I mean, this was a general phenomenon. Now, one should not, of course, expect any exact repeat of that, and developments could be very different in different countries. Both right-wing and left-wing extremism in Greece, secession demands, Catalonia in Spain, protest votes, the Five-Star Movement in Italy, the National Front in France. Populist parties in general are likely to gain many seats in the upcoming elections to the European Parliament. The most likely political outcome of all this, I would guess, it would be weaker and more unstable governments in general, and that the established parties are pushed into more xenophobic, populist, anti-EU directions, as is happening, I would guess, in the UK. And this will be bad enough, I would say. Now, what could one do to avoid this? Things could improve a bit if core countries, Germany in particular, pursued more expansionary fiscal policies. If Germany took steps to raise their wage costs through internal revaluations, that is combining increases in contributions paid by employers with, say, reductions in income taxes, so as to help crisis countries make real depreciations the back way. The ECB could do more to keep inflation in the whole euro area at the close to 2% target and not below. Sorry. Yeah. This would make it easier for the crisis countries to achieve real exchange rate depreciations, as it would lessen the requirements on nominal wage cuts. It would be even better if the ECB raised its inflation target somewhat to, say, 3 or 4%. Such a policy is risky because the downside is that the new target might not be credible, because markets might anticipate future rises in the future. Still, my view is that in this situation, it's probably a risk worth taking. Even with such policies, I think there will be unacceptable hardship in the crisis countries. And my conclusion is that it's very hard to believe that they will sustain the austerity programs required to substantially reduce their government debts. What will happen then? Well, for some time, financial markets might still buy the crisis countries' government bonds, anticipating that they could always resell them to the ECB in a new acute crisis. But at some point, there will be a sudden stop if government debt ratios go on increasing. And then the ECB will have to actually carry out bond purchases. The rescue fund, the ESM, might have to extend new loans. But this could never be a permanent solution, as the government debt ratios of the crisis countries would continue to rise. So if the euro is to be preserved in its present form, I think there must be debt forgiveness at some point. Best thing, I would say, in a world where politicians would be better than the ones we have. It's a rather unrealistic world. That would be to shortcut this adjustment process by writing down the crisis countries' government debts now through substantial haircuts. This would result in direct capital losses for both the ESM and the ECB. It would bring down a number of banks holding large amounts of government bonds. So for this solution to work, there must be resources provided at the European level to recapitalize failing banks. But these resources do not exist today. There has been a deal on a banking union, which includes setting up a common resolution fund based on contributions from banks, which will be built up over the coming 10 years. The problem is what to do in the meantime, and if the resources of this fund are overwhelmed, since the deal does not allow the ESM to be used for this purpose, and the ESM is anyway too small for this. And in addition, the EU failing banks looks extremely complex and bureaucratic. So one really has to doubt whether the EU would be able to handle significant debt write-downs and the consequences for banks. Another solution that has been advocated is instead to use the resources of the ECB. Radical proposal, that is to let the ECB actually buy bonds from the crisis countries and then exchange them to perpetual interest-free loans. Loans that would never be paid back, but they would still appear as assets on the ECB's balance sheet. Could this be done? Yes. It could be done in the short run by financing it through printing money. No risk of inflation in the current recession. But of course, when things return to normal again, then these increases in the money supply would have to be sterilized if inflation is to be avoided. This could be done in several ways. The ECB could issue bonds, own bonds, paying interest on them. But this would mean reduced profits for the ECB. And since these profits are distributed among the governments of the Eurozone, it would mean less future revenues for the governments. So it would have to be compensated for by tax increases or cuts in government expenditures. Another possibility would be to raise banks, private banks, reserve requirements, which would impose costs on the banks, which they would then pass on to their customers. So either way, using the ECB for dealing with the sovereign debt crisis in this way, it would mean that the citizens, taxpayers in Germany and other core countries do foot the bill. But it would not be so transparent, and it would be distributed over many years. Why am I speaking of this? Not necessarily because I advocate it, but I think this is what is going to happen ultimately, in some way or another. The probability, of course, increases if also France were to end up in a debt trap from which it can't escape. I believe it's anticipations that the ECB will, in the end, play a role of this type, rather than judgments that government debt developments are under control, that explain the current calm in the financial markets. Will such policies work? Perhaps because they hide what is going on. So it's possible that voters will accept them. But there are also risks. Feelings might be created in core Eurozone countries that voters are being cheated by smart politicians and clever technocrats in the central banks in a non-transparent way. And it's of course impossible to know to where this could lead. Then there are the moral hazard problems. If countries with large government debts are bailed out in the end, will the new economic policy frameworks in the EU provide sufficient incentives for fiscal restraint in the future? I very much doubt that. To sum up, the euro crisis is far from over. The problem of the government debt overhang is not solved. It can be solved over time through fiscal restraint in the crisis countries, but this will entail unacceptable hardship and huge political risks. So debt forgiveness in some form is unavoidable. The best thing is to have it now, but this will not happen as a mechanism for dealing with an accompanying bank crisis are not in place. So debt forgiveness will have to come in the future instead. Most likely it will be done in covert ways, which will mean great risks in the long run. So, starting with a slightly more optimistic tone than the previous speaker, I end with a rather pessimistic one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lars. Well, we're going to have a panel now about this, and well, if we have some optimism then a lot of pessimism, I think that's a good start for discussion. So I would like to welcome up on stage Philippe again, please, to participate in the panel, and also Anna Felländer. Anna is the chief economist at Swedbank. And also I'd like Hans Tson Söderström, who is a young professor at Stockholm School for Economics and also a board member at Forest, and you were also the editor of the book where Lars wrote his chapter. So let's see, there's Hans there. I don't have a name tag, doesn't matter. So please, everyone. You're not falling off stage there, Anna.
Yeah.
No? It's okay. Good.
Unless you push me.
Good. Anna, I'll let you start actually. We've heard a perspective from Brussels and a perspective from Sweden, and an academic economist, and maybe a market perspective.
Yes. Some reflection from the financial. Is this on? No?
I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
Get a thumbs up there.
They say so.
I think
They
so.
say so.
If you try now, I think.
Hello? No?
If you just put it close, maybe to your mouth.
So do you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So what we see is a slow recovery in the Eurozone, but ahead it's going to be a bumpy road. I see the coming 2 years, policymakers will be tested. We have the ECB, with Draghi saying, if inflation is lower than expected, if credit supply is not developing in the way we expect, he will use his tools, he will use his machinery. So what tools do we have? We have the repo rate, lowering the repo rate, lowering the policy rate, LTRO, that is cheap money to the bank, and OMT, that is quantitative easing. So in my opinion, the first 3 tools will only have marginal effects on the market. So the Draghi put will finally be tested then. And as Lars talked about, the German taxpayers, the question is if they will be fooled or not. Then we have the banking union. The banking union will solve the next financial crisis, but not the current one. What we need is more integration. And what we talked about during this morning is the extremist national movement, the anti-EU movement, that will block steps ahead for achieving the reforms and the banking union we want to see. So the policymakers will be tested in May when the EU Parliament election will take place. So the link between banks and nations will not be cut until 2016. And before that, we will have stress tests that would probably push out some banks into the cold water. And then the states will have to deal with it, and interest rates will go up, and Draghi put will be tested. So I agree with Lars that even though it's not in my bank's main scenario, there is a great risk that the Draghi put will be tested. And I also think that it's in my responsibility as economist to lift up research by, for example, Joachim Röst, who's written in Economic Debatt, a magazine in Sweden where famous academic people write, about the net effect on public finances from social tourism. So the discussions, for example, in UK, over which the recent 10 EU members have been a burden to the richer countries' public finances. His research shows that it has a positive net effect on public finances. So the reason for that is that the immigrants are in the age frame, that they're in the labor force and they're productive, and also their education-wise, they show that they have positive effect. Even though if you adjust for them growing older and having a more burden on the public finances. So with that said, we need more integration, and maybe we need to be more transparent, or ECB need to be more transparent when it comes to explaining why and how the increased balance sheets will affect taxpayers in the end.
Thank you, Anna. Hans, you wrote about different ways to solve, actually that several solutions are needed at once, you wrote about in the book. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a bit about that, please?
Well, let me start by saying that I'm just as pessimistic about the situation as the earlier speakers here, and the tragedy, I think, with the European situation is that there are indeed a number of economically sensible solutions to the present situation. This is not a one-way street. There are many options. The problem is that all reasonable economic solutions are, for some reason, politically impossible. You know, when I'm teaching at the Stockholm School of Economics, I give a course in the history of macroeconomic regimes. And what we see today is really that history is repeating itself. I go back 100 years, and don't fall asleep now, because this is extremely relevant for the present situation. When World War I broke out 100 years ago, we left the gold standard. We had been living, all the developed world had been living on the gold standard for at least 40 years. And it was extremely beneficial to world trade and to economic expansion in the whole world. When the war broke out, all countries left the gold standard to print money to finance the war. That's natural. But when the war was over, the question came, should we go back to the gold standard? It was reasonable that most countries tried to go back on the gold standard because it had served us so well for many years. The main question became, should we go back to the gold standard at the old parity of gold, or at the gold price that actually prevailed after the war, because there had been high inflation as a result of printing money, particularly right after the war. And there was a divergence between, I would say, economists on one side and politicians on the other. Politicians said we must go back to the old gold price, to the old parity for gold. because this is a moral issue. We promised we would go back to economists said, on the other hand, that is a very dangerous path to go, because prices have increased tremendously during and after the war, and we need, if we want to go back to the old parity, we need to have a high deflation to push down prices. And as always in this world, the politicians had their way. Not in all countries, but in Sweden and many other countries, the politicians decided we will push through the deflation and go back to the old gold parity. So, unemployment in Sweden jumped to 24%. There were bankruptcies all over, like a harvest, all over the Swedish business community. A majority of the smaller banks failed and were not saved at that time. So, and of course, after this came a big political turmoil, and after a long series of events, we finally got Nazism in Germany, fascism in Italy, new political movements, eventually leading up first to the Great Depression and then to World War II. I have been telling my students when I've been teaching about this, that could happen in those days before we didn't have any real democracies yet. It could never happen again. And what we see today is that precisely this, a monetary principle is overtaking the handling of the economy in the interest of employment, growth, etc. It's just the one monetary principle that is taking over. And of course we need some kind of monetary principle, but as Lars has talked about, and as we've heard many others say, there are solutions. We could have economic expansion in the northern parts of Europe, the more solid countries. We could have internal competitiveness adjustments via employers' contributions or via higher wages in Germany and reduction in employer contributions in Southern Europe. We could have debt forgiveness. We could have this idea of the ECB buying up debt. And of course, we could also have a solution with a dissolution of the euro, partial or complete. But the tragedy is that all these possible solutions, and economists have really been generous in providing possible solutions, they're all politically impossible. Don't ask me why.
I think we've touched on the subject of austerity without actually using the word a few times. Because what we are talking about is that what you said first, Lars, was that austerity actually works in theory. You could get back
even in practice.
Even in practice,
a long time.
But it takes a long time. So it might be politically very complicated to actually make it work. And you say that, well, you also touched on the subject really when you say that we really put down the economy too much. Has there been too much of austerity, and could something be done now to help it up? Who wants to start?
Well, I could just repeat what I said before. I mean that this is why we need debt forgiveness to shortcut the process. It works technically, but I mean it produces unacceptable effects because it takes so long time and it carries huge political risks, as I said. Now, I don't think there is any threat that things will go as bad as they did in the politically as in the 1920s and 1930s. I mean, where the largest political problems then were in countries that were young democracies. We don't have that young democracies anymore, they're a bit older. It was also the countries that had lost the First World War. But still, I mean, I think I sketch a more realistic picture of what might happen politically. But as I said, xenophobia, anti-EU sentiments, so protest votes giving unstable governments and so on, that is bad enough. I mean,
Debt forgiveness, is it unavoidable?
Well, it's interesting to note, I happen to spend most of my time in Portugal these days because I'm married to a diplomat. It's interesting, as Lars pointed out, that all these countries that are suffering so terribly now, they want to stay within the euro. It's hard to discuss with them the option of leaving the euro. And also, they want to pay back all their debt. I mean, people are suffering, as Philippe was describing so eloquently. People are really starving in many cases. Still, the public opinion is, we don't want debt forgiveness. We will prove that Portugal, and I'm sure we'll hear the same thing in Greece, that Portugal and Greece, that we all pay back our debt. Therefore, as I think debt forgiveness is a very important part, one way is to do it via the Ecb, that the Ecb buys up the debt and takes it on its balance sheet, and then hopefully people will forget about it, but sooner or later they will pop up again, of course. But the other way is to have an outright debt write-down, as was done for Greece. I only think that the initiative for such a debt write-down cannot come from these individual countries. It must be a joint decision by the European Union that because of the situation we are in, we're all benefited from debt write-down in some of these countries. And don't ask me to tell you exactly which countries, because that's a very tricky issue. We could spend the rest of the day on that. But some debt relief would definitely help. But it has to be a collective decision by the European Union, that it is done for the sake of economic activity in the Union.
What do you say, Philippe? Could I buy Greek bonds now, or is it...
Well, I mean, I just want to complement what I said earlier. I was asked to paint a picture of the crisis, which I think undeniably is negative. By nature, I'm an optimist, and I don't think, I'm not, just because the picture is negative doesn't mean that there aren't solutions. And the solutions actually are quite clear. When I first became an advisor to President Barroso, I set them out back in 2010. The first thing you need to do is you need to have bank restructuring. You need to sort out viable banks from unviable ones. You recapitalize the viable ones, and you close down or wind down the unviable ones. Second of all, you need to restructure debts. And most of actually the Eurozone's problems are private sector debt, not public sector debt. So you see most of it is excessive household debt in places like Ireland and Spain. It's excessive corporate debt, as the IMF pointed out, in many countries. And in some countries, notably Greece, it is excessive public sector debt. You need to recognize that and write down that debt. And the third is you need to have a viable growth strategy, which means you need to have reforms combined with investment. And we haven't actually had reforms that promote growth. Most of the reforms have been about pushing down wages. Now, pushing down wages when you have a high stock of debt actually pushes you into a bigger hole, because if your wages are lower, the real burden of your debt is greater. What instead you need is reforms to promote much greater competition. And we haven't had much of that at all. I mean, it's striking. There are all sorts of things which I describe in the book which you could do, which hasn't been done. And last but not least, we haven't had that complement of investment, partly because we haven't fixed the banking system so that viable new companies don't have the funding to grow, and partly because governments mostly have slashed capital spending in their austerity programs when they should have protected that really important investment in future growth. So there are solutions to the crisis of the Eurozone. It doesn't have to be endless doom and gloom. It's just a question of having the political courage to make those decisions. What makes them complicated, as I described in my initial remarks, is that the relations between creditors and debtors are between countries, or initially between French and German banks and households in the south, and now increasingly with taxpayers interposed, and that makes it politically difficult.
Okay. Could I ask you just a quick question? I know that we will be discussing the banking crisis in the afternoon, But when you're saying sorting out viable from non-viable banks,
Yes.
and solving the banking crisis, the problem is, of course, that this is directly related to the sovereign debt crisis. I mean, if a bank is viable or not depends on what is the value of all its holdings of government debt. So in which order do you want to take this? I mean, when you sort the banks, it depends on how much Greek and Portuguese bonds and whatever they hold, right?
Yes, exactly. Next year the ECB is conducting, or this year actually, is conducting an assessment of the quality of the assets of banks' balance sheet, and that needs to include an assessment of the value of the bonds that they hold in their balance sheets, clearly. But in order for banks to be able to absorb the losses from the debt restructuring of insolvent governments, of, say, debt-to-equity swaps for households who can't pay back their mortgages, for companies, for banks to recognize that companies aren't going to be able to pay back some of their loans, you need to have banks with a good capital buffer so they can absorb. The bank restructuring has to come first.
Yeah, I agree. The most crucial thing for growth and recovery is that credit comes out to the system. And when we talk about recovery, we should also put into light some of what's driving the recovery slowly. That is Germany and Spain. And Spain have shown that reforms and making the labor market more flexible and pushing labor costs down has led to a positive current account, and also that we have the international recovery coming in combination with the tapering, which will give us not a strong euro that will hamper export. We could see also that export could drive those countries out of recession and into more stable growth. But it will take time. But the tone is a bit too pessimistic for my view here, because I see that there is underlying forces that with private leverage, there has been deleverage in the private sector, and we're on the right way. Austerity will be less this year compared to next year, and we have the market rates going down. Everyone believes in the Draghi put, so that's fine for now. But still, it's the transmission mechanism, getting credit out to the small and medium-sized companies that is crucial.
But Swedbank's main scenario isn't another haircut.
We'll see a haircut in Greece, but it will have not systematic results
Isn't it a safe prediction that when these stress tests are carried out later this year, that all government debt will be regarded as 100% safe?
I think
which is not particularly realistic.
We will get into that in the afternoon, I believe, because that's quite tricky.
So stay on.
Lars, please.
Yes, yeah. Well, I'm not convinced that we need sort of a large-scale debt forgiveness for private sector debts. I think the crucial thing is government debt, so that governments don't need to be as contractive in their fiscal policies. I think that is the crucial thing. So there could be some debt forgiveness in the private sector, but I don't think on a huge scale. Structural reforms, well, this is a catchword. I mean, if we can't think of anything else, then we say that, well, these countries need structural reforms and that will give a lot of growth, without always being so precise. But of course, opening up various service sectors for more competition and so on would be helpful. But it's no deus ex machina. I mean, it will not happen. It will not affect growth very much in the short run. It does in our models, in fact, because in modern, well, the models that I teach in macroeconomics, if potential output in the future goes up, then demand today goes up by as much. But well, I teach my students this, but I don't really believe in it. It doesn't work in that way. But it's a nice model. Finally, banking union. I'm more pessimistic there than Anna. I don't think, as it's constructed, it will not deal with future crises if they are big enough. It will deal with minor or banking crises in the future that are of a moderate size. But I mean, the flaw in what has been agreed is that even if this resolution fund is built up, resources will not be enough for a really large-scale crisis. I mean, then it is the ESM and an expanded ESM that will be needed. And it will not, I mean, for the next 10 years, the resolution fund will not have, but will have only gradually increasing resources. So more needs to be done with respect to the banking union. But I agree, this is a very crucial thing. And in fact, banking union should have come before, I think, many of the attempts to have more fiscal integration, because one started in the wrong end, because this is a crucial thing.
I would like to get some questions from the audience. I think some of my colleagues have microphones for Mimi there. Maybe someone else will help her. But I'll just have one more short question before I let in the audience. If growth really starts now, some countries will grow more than others because of rebound effects for some of the countries, and some of them simply have catching up to do still, like the Baltic countries. That will mean that they will probably have, again, negative interest rates because of, since they are in the Eurozone. Can it be avoided that there will be more bubbles and more problems ahead for those countries? I mean, Spain clearly couldn't keep loans down during the last, well, they built up a bubble before the crisis. Can it be avoided that will happen again? Someone?
I think bubbles is the least problem we have to worry about these days, maybe with the exception of Sweden, but even there I'm not sure. Let me just add that from my point of view, when it comes to solutions of the crisis, the whole burden is on Germany. It's really Germany that has deviated from the rest of Europe, not only from Southern Europe, in terms of improving competitiveness tremendously and very impressively, but it has created a problem for all of the rest of Europe. So Keynes said repeatedly in the 40s that what brought down the gold standard was that the whole adjustment burden is put on the deficit countries. If you want a monetary system that works, you must have a symmetry between adjustments in surplus countries and in deficit countries. So Germany has to take a much larger share of the adjustment that is needed within Germany. And from this point of view, if I can make a personal comment, the appointment of Wolfgang Schäuble again to the new government is a catastrophe for Europe.
Let me add on just there that, reformulate your question somewhat. I mean, could growth solve the problem? It did in a way after the Second World War. Then many countries had huge debts. About half of them disappeared because of primary surpluses, about half because growth for a long period was above interest rates. But that was in a way natural after the war. I mean, there was an enormous growth potential. There is some growth potential now, of course, in the countries which are in deep recessions, but it can't make the same contribution. It's not the same potential as it was after the Second World War.
It's a question from Bart van Ark. Bart will speak after the coffee break, but please.
Yes, but I cannot leave it to ask a question in this session. This session is called the Euro in Crisis. So in 5 months we have parliamentary elections. Philippe already referred to that. Some countries, like the Netherlands, for example, which I follow very closely, 40% of the votes may go to the extreme left and extreme right and to European parties. So it's going to be exciting in the European Parliament, and it's going to be very exciting in the election campaign. So my question to the panel members is, what is the narrative on the question why we need the euro? Because these parties are going to talk about, we don't need the euro. And I haven't heard many intellectual Europeans have a good reply to that. What is a convincing story to tell, and Philippe, I'm sure that you thought about it, having written about it, a convincing story to tell about all these critics that will be out there in the campaign and say this is all euro nonsense, we don't need it. What's the answer?
Maybe you would like to start, Philippe.
Well, I mean, the reason why the euro was created was for two reasons. The less important one was economic, which was that it was a belief that to have a genuine single market, you needed to have one money. That was closer integration in trade and closer integration in finance. It achieved that. Unfortunately, the closer integration in finance took the form of bank lending, which was often bad bank lending, but we'll leave that to a side. The political case is set out in the Treaty of Rome, to which Sweden as well has signed up, which is ever closer union between the peoples of Europe, and monetary union being a step towards a closer political integration. There was also a sub sort of text to that, which was after German reunification. It was the price that President Mitterrand of France demanded of Helmut Kohl in order to agree to that reunification. So that's why the euro was created. Why would you want the euro to stay together? Well, I mean, to the extent that the members of the euro still feel that they have a common destiny, that is the political reason for doing it. On the negative economic side, it is that the costs of breaking it up would be absolutely astronomical. And you can see very clearly, I mean, even in Greece, where the suffering is literally, I mean, I was in Greece recently, but the suffering there is literally horrific. You still see a majority of people want to keep the euro because they fear that actually if they left the euro, their euros would be converted into drachmas and there'd be hyperinflation, their savings would disappear. And because they feared that it would mean exclusion from being part of Europe, and therefore, you know, what sets them apart from their Turkish neighbours who used to be their colonial masters, or their Balkan neighbours who are unstable, is the fact they're part of the euro, and so politically they're deeply committed to it. So that is what's holding the euro together. Clearly, medium to long term, you need to have a positive story about the euro as well, and that has to be about making the institutional changes necessary so that in future it can be an engine for growth rather than a shackle that holds people back.
Short from Anna as well.
Yes, what's interesting is that financial markets tend to underestimate the political will in this community. So even though you have all those reasons from economic point of view, the political will is beyond that.
I see. Actually, I have lots of more questions, and I think many of you have as well. But it's a few minutes after 11 now, and we have some hours ahead of us. So I think we need coffee now. So please, we'll be back at 20 past 11. Thank you very much. Jag talar på scenen igen.
Kan jag göra det här? Ja,